Daniel 2, starting at verse 31. You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. This image's head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay, and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed together, and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. The wind carried them away, so that no trace of them was found. And the stone that struck the image, and the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Amen. Tonight we are starting to look at Nebuchadnezzar's dream. This will be the first lesson in this. I'm not exactly sure how many lessons it will take to get through this. But we want to start at the very beginning, not at verse 31, but going back to the top of the chapter. And we'll see the first thing that we come to in studying this dream of King Nebuchadnezzar is the very first prophecy that is brought to our attention and explained to us. Now, this dream is not properly a prophecy of Daniel. It is a dream God gave the king that Daniel interpreted. So there's a slight difference there. God did not give Daniel the prophecy. God gave Nebuchadnezzar the dream, and then Daniel interpreted the dream. It so happens that both the dream and its interpretation are, in fact, prophetic. See, God could have given this dream and its interpretation to Daniel without involving Nebuchadnezzar at all. But God saw fit to give this dream through the king. It is important in the life of Daniel, in his position, and what God tends to do with Daniel, as we will see as we go through this part of our study. Through this event, God brought Daniel to the notice of the king, when he otherwise would have just been one of the Jewish boys in the back office. So God intervened with a plan for this dream to bring Daniel to the attention of the king. Revealing and interpreting this dream gave Daniel credibility that far exceeded the education he received at the University of Babylon, as we called it last time. And it's also set him apart from all the other advisors to the king. In verse 47, the king answered Daniel and said, Truly your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, since you could reveal this secret. He realized that Daniel had a unique relationship with the deity, and that Daniel's special abilities came from his God. Even though Nebuchadnezzar was a pagan, he saw this as something that had to be respected. And then in verse 48 it says, Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts, and he made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and chief administrator over all the wise men of Babylon. So this dream and its interpretation that God set up and God used, God purposed to bring Daniel to the king's attention. And not just bring him to his attention, but to open up some opportunity for Daniel that he would never have had otherwise. He placed Daniel in a superior position within the government of Babylon, and that gave him special privileges, it gave him special opportunities not available to any other government workers. And this put Daniel in a position where he could devote time to the visions God would eventually give to him. God had the right man. He just had to get him into the right place. And that right place was going to give him a position where he had the opportunity to do what God had called him to do. This wasn't mere chance. And this just wasn't making Daniel a wealthy, influential person just to be nice to Daniel. God had a plan behind all of this. In verse 49, it says that Daniel was not selfish with this position of privilege, but he shared this privilege with his three friends to the degree that he was able. So Daniel came to Babylon with his three friends. He went through school with his three friends. And remember the episode they had right at the beginning of their schoolwork, where they didn't want to eat the king's food. Well, these three friends stood with Daniel. So Daniel thought a lot of these three men. And when Daniel was given this promotion, he wanted these three friends to share in that promotion and to receive a blessing that was due them. Now, this dream, which we read at the opening of our lecture today, and its interpretation also serve as a table of contents for the following prophecies that God gave to Daniel. So if you would think about the head of gold and the chest of silver and the bronze and the iron and like that, that is all like a table of contents. And the prophecies that follow have to do with those parts of that image. Under different imagery, of course, but they all relate to this initial prophecy, this dream and its interpretation. God sent the dream to King Nebuchadnezzar shortly after Daniel and his friends graduated from the University of Babylon. You need to realize this, that God had a schedule on which he was working, and God was not wasting any time. Daniel and his three friends were taken captive in the 3rd year of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, which we learned last time was 606 BC. According to verse 5 in chapter 1, Daniel spent 3 years in training at the university. All right? In chapter 2, verse 1, we find the date given here for the dream to be the 2nd year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, which was 604 BC, which is 3 years after Daniel was taken captive. So God's time was perfect. God moved Daniel from Jerusalem to Babylon, got him into college, got him into this government job, and immediately puts him in a position to stand before the king to make an interpretation of this particular dream. So, in chapter 2, we see God setting the stage to bring Daniel to the notice of the king and place him in this position where God can use him to be his prophet. Now we're going to be looking at verses 1 through 15. We won't read each verse as we'll go through. I'll just kind of summarize in some of the verses I'll read. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. And when he awakens from this dream, he wants it interpreted. So, what does he do? He does probably what he's done many times before. He calls for the representatives of all classes of his magicians, or collectively we could call them the Chaldeans, and he tells them, I have had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to know the dream. That's a very deliberate statement on the part of Nebuchadnezzar. He's not just speaking off the top of his head. He knows what he's doing. And he says, guys, I'm anxious to know what? The interpretation? Doesn't say that, does it? It says, I want to know the dream. Guys, tell me the dream. Now, these Chaldeans apparently are used to such requests, and they consider themselves to be masters at interpreting dreams. That's what they do. Hey, these guys are smart. These guys went to college. These guys got the brains. They know how to do it. I don't know whether King Nebuchadnezzar went to college or not, but these Chaldean guys thought themselves to be intellectually superior to their king. Now, they wouldn't dare say that because they'd lose their head. But they just thought that they were something. And, I think that time and time again they'd been called in and they'd come up with some kind of interpretation. The king would say, I've had this dream and this is what it's about. What does it mean? And they say, oh, that's easy for us, king. It means such and such and such and such. But this time he says, my spirit is anxious to know the dream. Not the interpretation, but to know the dream. So these Chaldean guys, these men know that they do not really have any magical powers and that they just make up the interpretations to dreams. These guys are no fools. They're not idiots. They're smart, and they recognize that the power of their influence is the ignorance of other people. For the king to tell them a dream and then to come up with an interpretation, who's to say it's right, who's to say it's wrong? These guys can say whatever they want. Oh, king, that dream means that you should give us a raise. That means you should give us a better class of housing to live in. Lord, we don't want to drive a Ford, we want to drive a Lincoln. So give us a Lincoln to drive around Babylon in. These guys are no dummies. They could do that. So here they are, he says, I'm anxious to know the dream. These guys have thoughts going through their minds, and they just stand there waiting for the king to tell them the dream. There is a pregnant pause. And when the king keeps quiet, they ask him to tell them the dream. And they assure the king that once they know the dream, they can come up with the interpretation. Right. Verses 5 and 6 are very interesting. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, my decision is firm. Ooh. My decision is firm. What decision? Well, my spirit's anxious to know the dream. My decision is firm. Listen, if you do not make known the dream to me and its interpretation, you shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made an ash heap. However, if you tell the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts, rewards, and great honor. Therefore, tell me the dream and its interpretation. Well, he really puts it on them. Now, if you are a careful reader, you will notice that the king did not say that he had forgotten the dream. When we tell the Bible story to the kiddies in Sunday school or in the storybooks, we often teach it that he had the dream and he forgot what the dream was. And that's not what the Bible says. It doesn't say anything about him having forgotten the dream. He says, tell me the dream. Tell me the dream, guys. I want to know. Apparently, King Nebuchadnezzar was aware of their tricks. And he wants them to do the whole thing on their own. Come up with the dream, come up with the interpretation without my assistance. Guys, I'm not going to do your work for you. You do it yourself. Tell me the dream. Tell me the dream. Then in verse 7, they reiterate their request for the king to tell them the dream. It's like they didn't hear him. King, tell us the dream. And you see, they are concerned about the serious consequence the king has laid against them if they don't come up with the dream and the interpretation. These guys are worried. You see, if the king had actually forgotten the dream, why didn't they just make up both the dream and its interpretation? They knew that he was on to their trick. They weren't going to get away with it this time. I don't know what had happened before, but I kind of get the idea that King Nebuchadnezzar isn't really trusting these magicians anymore. I think he had been burned one too many times. And this is only his second year as king. I think they'd given him some bad advice. And knowing what we know about Nebuchadnezzar, he was a very serious ruler. He was not a man who played around, not a man who took his kingship lightly. He was interested in conquest. And I'm sure a lot of the dreams that he had, that he put out to them, they were telling him, oh, king, you're going to win over this country, you're going to win over this people, you're going to do this, you're going to do that. And, sometimes they probably were right, and sometimes they probably were wrong. But I think the king was on to their trick, and he was not going to be tricked by them. We see the king getting impatient with the Chaldeans. And he tells them that he knows that they're just stalling for time. Notice in verse 9 he says, "For you have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me." Does that sound like the king has any confidence in these guys? You've agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me. So I'm going to put you to the test. You tell me the dream, and then give me the interpretation. I want to see if you guys really know your business, or if you are just continuing your tricks. So we see here that undoubtedly Nebuchadnezzar was suspecting the Chaldeans of lying to him at other times. And if they would do that, they would lie to him at this time. In other words, he knows they really do not have the power to interpret dreams. He isn't just trying to catch them in their trick. You see, this dream troubled him. There was something about it that bothered him. And it troubled him so much, he said, "My spirit is anxious." And he wants to have, he must have, a truthful interpretation of it. I think he somehow felt that he was involved in this dream in some way. But he wasn't really sure. We've already read what the dream is. We know what the dream is. And it just starts off really nice with this head of gold and the silver and the bronze, and just kind of gets worse as it goes down, and then this stone coming down and just demolishing the whole thing. And if he thinks he's involved in this image in some way, and he sees it being demolished, and thinking, are we going to have a civil war? Are we going to have some other nation come in and destroy? I mean, he's upset. He's concerned. And he wants a real interpretation of the dream. The king wants to know what is going to happen, because he feels like it's all coming down on him. So, he responds to these guys, "Therefore, tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can give me its interpretation." There's the acid test. I will not believe you, I will not trust you until you tell me the dream. And that suggests that he knows what the dream is. And he's testing them to find out if they in truth can interpret dreams. Who's the smart one now? I think King Nebuchadnezzar is the smart one. These men do not want to be caught in their own trap. So they set up an argument to justify their inability to tell him the dream. They're looking for an out. He's already said, if you don't tell me the dream, I'm going to kill you guys. And they don't want that to happen. So they have to figure out some way to give a back door so they can get out of this predicament. Verses 10 and 11. It says, the Chaldeans answered the king and said, there is not a man on earth who can tell the king's matter. Therefore no king, lord, or ruler has ever asked such things of any magician, astrologer, or Chaldean. It is a difficult thing that the king requests. And listen, there is no other who can tell it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. These guys don't know it, but they have just stated the truth that Nebuchadnezzar is going to find out and is going to guide the rest of the prophecies of Daniel. First thing they say is, you've never asked us to do this before. You've always told us the dream. You've never asked us to do this before. Implying that it was unreasonable for the king to ask them to do it now. Now they would not come out and say that, because he just have their heads chopped off. So they are in a nice way implying, king, you're being unreasonable to ask us to tell you this dream. Second, they tell him to discover the dream is totally impossible for any human being. What you're asking us to do, king, just not humanly possible. I don't care how many college degrees we've got, how many PhDs we might have. It's just not humanly possible to do this. And third, and most important part of their answer, sets up the king's eventual recognition of Daniel's God. They said, except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. It would require, they're saying, the power of a God who is far greater than any and all the gods of Babylon. How true this is. You know, these Chaldeans were nominally religious men. They followed the religious customs of their pagan religions. And these guys knew that there was nothing to these pagan gods. This one's just a rock. This one's just an image carved out of wood. There's nothing there. So if the dream is going to be made known, there's going to have to be some deity better and bigger than all these false gods that we know. And they're telling the king, we don't know who that would be. Friends, actions have consequences. You might want to make a note of that. Actions have consequences. The deceitful dealings the Chaldeans had with their king now came back to haunt them. In verses 12 and 13, for this reason the king was angry and very furious, even though they tried to talk their way out of it. And he gave a command to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree went out, and they began killing the wise men. They didn't waste any time. This shows you how angry Nebuchadnezzar was. The ones that came in front of him, I imagine these guys were the first ones to be put down. And then soldiers go out, start visiting the houses of other of the wise men to put them to death. Bible says that Arioch, the king's captain, came to Daniel's house to kill him. Daniel, a recent graduate of the University of Babylon and brand new in the employment of the king, was shocked that he had been singled out for execution. And he asks Arioch why, and Arioch tells him. Well, the wise men weren't able to tell the king's dream, so all you guys are going to get killed. So the issue was the dream and the interpretation. Daniel, a smart young man, and I think a very capable young man, and a man with some wisdom that probably was in advance of his years, tells Arioch to let the king know that he will give him the interpretation. He does it. He says, Arioch, go tell the king I will give him the interpretation. And keep in mind, Daniel does not yet know what the dream was. He's just answered a knock on the door and says, tell the king I'll give him the interpretation. Was that stupidity? Was that arrogance? Or was that faith? I believe it was faith. I think Daniel had a strong idea that God had placed him in Babylon and in the king's service for a reason. And I think that knock on the door suggested to him that God's reason was about to be revealed. This is your opportunity, Daniel. Saints of God, we need to recognize God's opportunity. When God knocks, it's time to open the door, and it's time to speak up. Say, but I don't know what the answer is yet. Well, sometimes you have to step out on faith, not knowing what the answer is. Remember Abraham? I kind of think maybe, in my imagination, the story of Abraham's coming back to Daniel's mind. He stepped away from Ur of the Chaldees, looking for a city whose founder and maker was God. But he didn't find it. Stepped it out in faith, knowing that somehow it was there. And in God's time, that would be revealed. Daniel, I think, says this is God's time. Arioch, tell the king, I will give him the interpretation. You see, this wasn't just an effort to put off his execution. Daniel does the next important thing. He calls his 3 friends together, and they have a prayer meeting. And I can imagine it was not a now I lay me down to sleep kind of prayer meeting. I think they were in earnest before God, beseeching God, Lord, you have put us here for this purpose. This is the time. You see the challenge that you have put in front of us. You have given us the means to do what you want us to do. Now, Lord, you make it happen. Daniel knew he couldn't come up with a dream. He knew that. God, you are the one that's going to have to do that. And when we enter into the work of God, when God puts us in the place that he wants us to be, we do what we can do. But God has to do the work. And we need to have confidence that God will do the work. So they had prayer. And I don't know how long the prayer meeting lasted, but they got to a point where verse 19 comes in. Then the secret was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. Daniel and his 3 friends knew that God would reveal the dream. It didn't necessarily happen while they were in prayer, but it says here there was a night vision in which God revealed the dream to Daniel. So after this being revealed to him, there was a short praise service. And then Daniel calls up Arioch and tells him to make an appointment for him with the king. And in so doing, Daniel saves his life He saves the lives of his 3 friends, and he saves the lives of the rest of the Chaldeans. These guys should have been thankful. If you've read on into the book, you know there came a time when they expressed that they weren't thankful. But at the moment, I think they were glad that their heads were being chopped off. Now, let's look at the appointment. Daniel has an appointment to meet the king. And I think it's probably really soon after Arioch tells the king about Daniel, because remember, Nebuchadnezzar was anxious to know the interpretation of the dream. So Arioch tells the king that he's found a young man among the captives of Judah who will tell the king the interpretation. And when the king, Daniel comes to the king, Nebuchadnezzar asks him, "Can you do this?" I can imagine the king was jaded. I mean, he'd had wise men lying to him all the time. And he didn't know Daniel from anybody, so to speak. And he's probably thinking, what makes you different than all the other Chaldeans that have come before me? Can you do this? Notice how humble Daniel's answer is. I really like this. This touches my heart. Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, "The secret which the king has demanded, the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, and the soothsayers cannot declare it to the king. Listen, but there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets." Don't you just love this man? Don't you just love him? At the moment, he's got a master's degree from the University of Babylon. He's a smart guy. But he's not there to impress the king. He's saying, "Look, king, all these guys have failed you. They've lied to you. I know it. But listen, I'm not here in the same capacity as these guys are. There is a God in heaven who reveals secrets." And he does not brag on the fact that he has the answer, as if he figured it out on his own. But in verse 30 it says, "But as for me, this secret has not been revealed to me because I have more wisdom than anyone living, but for our sake who make known the interpretation to the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your heart." This man is a real humble man. I'm not so smart, king, that I can figure this out on my own. God reveals secrets, and God has chosen to reveal it to you. And let me explain what it means. Again, he reminds the king of the impossible nature of this request to tell the dream. He wants the king to understand this isn't me being so smart, because what you've asked is impossible for humans to do. What I'm going to tell you comes straight from God. And he holds out to the king what all people should remember. And listen, this is something you need to think about every day of your life. Every place you go, every time you open your mouth, every time you think a thought. There is a God in heaven who reveals secrets. You know, some people have the audacity that they can commit secret sins and keep on professing to be a holy living person. God has a way of revealing secrets. And at the time that you least expect it, and at the time that it is in your worst interest, God can reveal the secret that you have been keeping. And all people will come to know. Let that be a lesson to learn from this. Now, if you will read through there, you will notice that Daniel does not immediately tell the king the dream and its interpretation. Instead, he tells the king why God gave him the dream. Now this is important. Daniel's not just going to spout off. He knows what the dream is, and he knows what the interpretation is. But he begins with the preamble of why God would give you this dream. God's not just playing games. God has a purpose. In verses 28 and 29, but there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be, listen, in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head upon your bed were these. As for you, O king, thoughts came to your mind while on your bed about what would come to pass after this. And he who reveals secrets has made known to you what will be. There is a lot in what Daniel is telling the king. He is telling the king what will be in the latter days. And he says that God has made known to you what will be. There is some precise language in what Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar. And it would do modern day commentators well to understand that and to stick to what God told Daniel to tell the king. Many commentators imagine the expression "in the latter days" means the end times. In other words, the second coming of Christ. Tribulation, millennium, and things like that. And they have been programmed to think that because they've gone to seminary and they've studied theology, and when it comes to eschatology, more than likely they have been taught dispensational premillennialism. Now, we've already talked about that, right? We understand what that is. And premillennialists will reach back into the book of Daniel and pull out some of these prophecies. In fact, even this very dream and the statement about the latter days, and say, look, Daniel has to do with things in Daniel's time, but really the secret of it has to do with the end of time and the second coming of Christ. You can't get that out of the language Daniel uses. The New King James says, after this. The Authorized Version uses the word hereafter. And in the language Daniel was speaking, after this simply means after this. In other words, what happens next? That's what that means. God has given you a dream that shows you what happens next. Simple, isn't it? Latter times. What happens next? What will be? Or as the King James Version says, what shall come to pass? This implies only the next in a series of events. So God has shown you what happens next, and then the series of events that follows that up to the end of what this dream is all about. So it is totally inappropriate to the language God gave Daniel to use to apply any part of this dream to the end times, to a rapture, to a millennium, or to the second coming of Christ. Now, I'll give you a little glimpse into it. It does have to do with the first coming of Christ, but not the second coming of Christ. So, the events in Nebuchadnezzar's dream depict only things that will happen from the time of Nebuchadnezzar through the times of the events shown to him. And I'm not going to say any more about that because as we go on to our next lecture, we will look at these events and explain them as Daniel reveals them to the king. Furthermore, we need to understand this. While the events pictured in the dream have to do with world events, and they do, with empires coming up over time, they have to do that. But unknown to Nebuchadnezzar is the fact that these are events which God's chosen people, the Hebrews, will have to endure until the coming of Messiah. So in short, the dream pictures some things that will be explained more precisely in some of the later prophecies of Daniel. World events that will impact the Hebrews, Daniel's generation, and those that follow, as world events change up to the coming of Messiah. And these events go no farther than the coming of Messiah. Amen.